hosting Fran and Rachel tonight. This evening's event is being put on by Women in Industrial Design, otherwise known as WID. And just in case you haven't heard of WID before, WID is a collective of 9 women who are all invested in bridging the gender gap often found in the realm of ID. We hope to do this by sharing personal stories, helpful resources, and by collaborating with industry leaders, much like we're doing this evening. If you'd like to find out more, Michaela will pop our website into the chat, and you can check us out there. For this first conversation, we're going to be hosting 2 of Yona's co-founders, Fran and Rachel. Tonight, Fran and Rachel will be telling us more about what inspired them to found Yona, and will bring us into the design process they went through to develop the Yona concept. For all of the attendees, if you have any questions during the presentation, and I hope that you do, please post them in the Q&A portion of the chat. And without further ado, I'll now pass the stage off to Fran and Rachel.
Awesome, thank you, Miranda. We're super excited to be here today. And we are Yona, as Miranda described, and we are redesigning the pelvic exam experience. Many of you in the audience have probably had one at some point, but if you haven't, it's typically an outpatient procedure, and it's done with this device here that you see. This device is called the speculum, and in short, it's kind of like a tire jack for the vagina, and it allows a provider to inspect the tissues as well as take tissue samples if they need it. So we started Yona in 2017, and it is the brainchild of 4 of us, engineers and designers. I am Fran Wang, and I'm a mechanical engineer.
And hi, I'm Rachel Hobart, and I'm a designer. And Yona is a project that we really started of our own will. And like Fran mentioned, this is something that we prompted out of our own experiences. And logistically, we work at Frog, but this is client agnostic. So this is something that we do in our own time. And really how we've been able to make this work is that we do it out of our passion and really our own dedication. So there were originally 4 founders, Hailey and Sahana in the middle here, as long as with Fran and myself. And really before Yona became Yona, Hailey and Sahana, how this happened is that they had their pelvic exams in the same week. And, you know, as designers, we're really trained to look at experiences, products, brands, kind of you name it, and ask why. Why does it have to be this way? And that really kicked off our first phase of research. And this is when Fran and I kind of came on board after Hailey and Sahana finished that first phase. And so we started in 2017, and since then we've really done a lot of work. And to really better understand the breadth of work, we like to describe them in phases. So we really have 4 phases that we've done to date. And the first is what I mentioned before with Hailey and Sahana, which was this research. This is research that we did where we spoke with patients and providers, and we compiled a video out of that, which we practiced radical empathy. Then we went into our phase 2, and this is really where the bulk of the Yona work took place. This is where we did our branding. We took the learnings from our phase 1 research and applied them to our concepts and some of our open sourced ideas that are on our website, as well as the initial speculum design. We built our website as well as our Instagram and really started talking to people and putting our ideas out there. Phase 3, we focused on research with LGBTQ+ patients, as well as published an article with our findings and our thesis, which Fran will touch on later. And then phase 4 was a part of the speculum development and MVP, which Fran will also touch on in a bit. So really, we initially set out to start this conversation to destigmatize vaginal health. Based on what we learned in our research, the exam itself is so anxiety-inducing that people just don't get their exams. And this really became the provocation, and our driving force was that the exam shouldn't be so horrible that people just avoid it. And whether that be from discrimination, anxieties about the tools of the procedures, past traumas, we really wanted to change this to really empower people to take care of their health.
So that provocation is where we started our work, but part of why we continue our work is just because pelvic exams are such a critical part of preventative healthcare. They can be awful, but they are a super efficient and fast way for providers to screen for any disorders, as well as to check for cancer. And these cancers, namely cervical cancer, actually have a fairly high survival rate if detected and treated early on. So, you know, getting an exam can really tip the scales between life and death. Additionally, if we look backwards in time, the speculum really hasn't changed very much in 200 years, and the origins are extremely misogynistic and racist. So J. Marion Sims, who is deemed the father of gynecology, was the inventor of the speculum. And in his early journals, he actually documents how he found female genitals to be repulsive, even though he's a gynecologist. And so he developed a tool to lessen his discomfort. He then tested this tool as well as other surgical procedures on enslaved Black women. These women obviously did not have a choice in consent, nor were they given anesthesia during this testing. And so we find it really important to remember their names as well. They are Lucy, Anarcha, Betsy, and there are countless other women whose names aren't even documented. While we were doing this work in 2017 and 2018, we found that it wasn't just us who were learning and really pushing for improving this process. At the time, there really felt like there was a zeitgeist of interest in reclaiming this space and addressing these taboos and bringing this type of care out from this shame that often surrounds it and hides it, and being able to talk about it more openly. So at this time, in this photo, actually, there were protests happening in New York in Central Park because there's a statue there of J. Marion Sims. And there was a lot of outcry to have that statue removed because of what he stood for in terms of the origins of gynecology. And then with all that change and enthusiasm, we're looking not just at the speculum as an archaic tool, but also at the whole exam process, which is pretty outdated. We'll often hear language like women's health or well women exam, but this exam doesn't just apply to people who identify as women. There are people who are transgender, asexual, or intersex who might also need this exam as well. And in addition, we often find that this exam can be unempathetic towards people who have had history of sexual trauma and abuse. This exam can be super triggering, and so some of these people are foregoing exams entirely. And although there are a ton of great providers, and we do want to shout out midwives, doulas, culturally responsive providers, inclusive and informed practices out there, for the most part, though, this exam does not serve modern people.
And so early on, we really decided to redesign something that hasn't been redesigned in nearly 200 years, that we were going to do it with consideration of everyone who has a vagina. And what we know is that not everyone with a vagina identifies as female. And so really being inclusionary of all folks with a vagina was a decision that we made early on, and we have really decided to stick to that throughout. Transgender and agender folks equally need to have regular pelvic exams, as they may also develop cervical cancer. And we see this as really a crucial part of health. So when we're applying inclusion to action in terms of our design, we don't use female pronouns. We don't use the term women's health or the well women's exam, as Fran mentioned. And we also really aim to be allies and raise voices of marginalized groups within healthcare. This also comes across in our brand character, Jamie, which is an intentionally androgynous name. And we created Jamie to be related to real people. So we want Yona to be accessible to everyone that has these experiences, regardless of gender identity, race, age, sexual orientation, or etc. And our brand character we see as just one aspect of the Yona system that really brings humanness back into this sterile exam that hasn't been considered in so long. So as I mentioned earlier, we did 2 rounds of research. So these are photos from our first phase of research, where we spoke with various patients and providers. And the goal was really to understand the journey as a whole. And this really illuminated a few things for us. So the first is that the speculum needs to be redesigned. There's visible screws and the sound of it cranking open, the cold metal. There's really just a lot that can be improved here. And the second is that the speculum doesn't live on its own. So this is really just one moment as a part of an entire ecosystem of the experience. We actually found that the speculum wasn't the most anxiety inducing. It's the steps leading up to it. So we wanted to really take a hard look at that as well. We really found that the improvements go beyond just the device itself, even though we are focusing on the speculum first and foremost. And as I mentioned, so our goal is to really be an ally, and as well-intended as we were kind of lacking the research to back this up. So we knew that we were lacking the diversity in our first initial participant pool. And, while we had providers and patients that, had various experiences and age ranges, they were all patients that were cis straight women. And so we did an interview with Autostraddle. I believe this was in 2018. And Autostraddle is a queer women / non-binary online publication. And we really asked the writer to put a call out, a call to action for inbounds for us, because we really wanted to speak with people in this community and also speak with people outside of our networks. And so through that, we found a large number of participants that were willing to talk to us and share their experience with us. And this was really exciting because we're constantly learning, and something that, keeps us going, and we want to do right by these people.
Yeah, as Rachel's saying, this phase of research was super exciting for us. So over the course of a month, we spoke with several participants from the LGBTQ+ community. These were people who had either reached out to us because of the Autostraddle article, or they were people who had actually reached out to us separately. Just as soon as Yona was launched, we had people who were so willing and so open and wanted to share their stories with us. We also had connections just through some of the providers we've worked with and within our own network. So we did participant interviews with all these people. Some of them identified as queer, bisexual, pansexual, non-binary, asexual, transgender, and some of these people had also experienced sexual assault or other traumas. This was pre-COVID, and so we did several of these interviews in person here in San Francisco, but we also did many of them over the phone. And we actually really enjoyed the freedom that afforded us, because it meant we could interview people from all over. San Francisco is quite the bubble, and so it was really informative and really great to be able to talk to people from other regions in the US. So the outcome of this was an article that we published in June of last year. We'll share the article link at the end of this, and if you're interested, we would love it if you would check that out. Honestly, writing this article was really hard because there were so many things that we wanted to put into here. Every single thing that we learned deserved its own article and deserved a lot of attention because of all the nuances and details. But for this article, we did compress all of our findings into 6 key points. And in these 6 points, we cover things like the biases and shortcomings and stigmas of exams today. So these are some of the shortcomings of the exams that patients feel, as well as some of the stigmas that they might feel towards the exam itself. We also talk about just the sheer amount of labor, of advocacy and research that some of these patients have to do. This is on top of the work that a lot of cisgender heterosexual women already have to do in order to be believed and heard during these exams. And then we also touch on some of these larger systemic issues that go beyond what just happens in the clinic. This goes as far back as medical educational system and as far forward as all these adjacent services like insurance and other logistics that are all tied to healthcare. So coming out of this phase of research, Rachel and I were filled with a lot of energy to do more research. There are so many directions you could take this. We thought about furthering our process and just doing more interviews with queer patients, but also trying to get an intersectional lens on this and talking to people of different races, or more people of different races, and cutting across socioeconomic status as well. We also, want to branch out what Yona could be entirely. Like, what are other elements of the experience that we could change? What are even other devices? People talk about the stirrups or the table as maybe the next place that we should turn our attention to, or even sometimes different processes entirely. So the mammogram, for example, or obstetric care and maternal wellness. But it is just the two of us, Rachel and I, and we both balance our full-time jobs as well as all the work and love that we put into Yona, as well as life itself. And so we really needed to hone in our focus. And with that, we decided that for now, we are focusing on getting the speculum to a point of viability. So at this time, we revisited the work that we had done early on. During that very first and second phase, we had done initial thinking around what a speculum would be like, what the Yona speculum would be. And we went back to that lens. This involved going back to these basics and reviewing what that core functionality and what those requirements were. So things like the field of view that the provider needs, as well as the range of motion this device needs to have, the amount of leverage that the provider needs in order to open the speculum, to key points of patient comfort, like not having exposed screws that could pinch, not having these really terrible audible cues like jingling metal. And also, this is a device that has two users. There's a provider as well as a patient. How do we account for the ergonomics of both while making this a unified device? So we had these core functionalities, but in addition to that, we also had some of these key design goals that we knew we had to hit. So we wanted this to be approachable, right? If you look at the metal speculum today, it looks really archaic. It looks really scary. And if you look at the plastic one, it's also kind of like, it's a medical device and it just is creepy. And so we knew we wanted ours to become something that's more approachable, less intimidating. But in addition to that, we also knew that we needed this to be something that a provider would actually want to use. So if this isn't an adoptable device, no patient will ever experience it because the provider is not going to use it. So we knew we needed to equal or improve upon existing functionality and also make it something that's attainable for providers so that it's something they would actually use in clinic. So with that in mind and combining those requirements and those design goals, we evaluated what was the best engineering strategy to actually serve both the design as well as the function. So we also wanted to unify the form. As you can see, there are a few key pieces here that all have their own function. So there's a lever that opens these leaves, and then there's the handle that you're actually holding. So we wanted these pieces to each tell a story about how they're used, but also to be unified into one language and make it one articulate piece. So going into this, we kind of already knew what material we wanted to use because we knew we had a story around this is a reusable piece. So it needed to be cleanable and autoclavable. So we went into this design knowing that we were going to use stainless steel with autoclavable silicone on the outside. But from there, we did a lot of CMF explorations into what the colorways could be, which is what you see on the right. So at the time of this development, we were actually also trying to meet an external deadline. This was not last year, 2 years ago now. And we were gearing up to go to Design Miami as part of Instagram's Design for All. And we wanted to actually reveal our speculum at this event. So we were on a super tight deadline. At this point, we were starting to work with our manufacturer to get this one unit made. And it was a lot of very close collaboration and close communication. So on the left, you'll see this is the very first photo we got. This is fresh off the machine, and they sent us a photo so that we could look at it. And then in addition, on the right, there were a lot of conversations around the colors. So with a device like this one, color is absolutely paramount to making it work. If you get the color off, it could look really creepy or, flesh tone, or it could look like a toy. And we really needed to strike that balance right. And so this was a lot of close conversations with them, sending samples back and forth to make sure that we could get the color exactly what it needed to be. And all in, we did this in 1.5 weeks, which is really tight, as you can imagine. So this is the appearance model that we had made. We're super happy with how the colors turned out. We feel like we really struck this nice balance of it being approachable and friendly, but also that this is a medical device and it's not just a toy. It has purpose and it's going to be used in a clinical setting. And even though this is just an appearance model, the CAD that actually went into this is an MVP for us. So it has all the functionality that we wanted built into that. And with that CAD, we really set ourselves up to continue development going forward and wrap in any new changes that we need. All in, we're super proud of this model, and we were really excited to be able to finally hold it in our hands and see it that way and evaluate it that way. So this was a major milestone for us at the time and something that we're really proud of.
Amazing. Yeah. So we get this question a lot, which is what's next? And for us, it's very simple. It's that we want to get a speculum to the market. And the way that the most efficient and effective way to do that is to partner with an existing organization, and an organization that has the resources and the expertise that we need to do this, like I said, the most efficient way possible. There are a lot of challenges in bringing a new medical device to market, including time, cost, and FDA. But we're really optimistic in our path forward. But one thing that you can do today is you can connect with us on Instagram. This is a way that we like to connect with our community. And yeah, this is where we can kind of update people. It's a little bit easier than updating a website every time. So follow our Instagram, it's yona.care. One other thing you can do is read our article that Fran mentioned, and we will, I think, link it in the chat, where we list some great resources as well. And so we'll leave you with our mantra, which is that vaginas are amazing and taking care of them should be too. Thanks.
That was excellent. Thank you so much. We've got quite a few questions. So if you want to leave this slide up, we can run through a few of these. Are you two ready? There's quite a few.
Yeah,
totally.
Awesome.
This is such a weird view because like you can't see anyone.
I know. So Sophie asks if you would mind talking a little bit more about the decision to use radical empathy as a research methodology early on in the project.
Yeah, Rachel, you want me to take this one?
I can take it or you can, whatever you want.
Go for it.
Okay, cool. So like I mentioned, so Hailey and Sahana were really leading our first phase of research as I was moving down to the San Francisco studio and Fran hadn't quite joined Frog yet. So we actually weren't a part of that first phase, but we adopted it very quickly after. So can't speak exactly to the reason for using radical empathy, but know that it was a practice used by other agencies, and I'm failing the name of who invented it, but really felt like it was kind of the perfect scenario for the situation that we're talking about, which is, a situation that's in private. These are personal experiences. We are able to, Hailey and Sahana were able to take the stories that they heard in research and apply that method so that we could share outwardly kind of with our studio, but also kind of with the world more publicly, while having those users remain anonymous. So just having a really impactful practice. And it is a really effective research method, and I really encourage anyone to try it if you're curious. I've also done a few exercises since then and really found that it lands just the same.
Yeah, I want to add, this particular exam is kind of one of those things where if you know, like if you're in the secret, you know how terrible it is. And it was super interesting because during our research and just over the course of Yona existing, if I bring it up in conversation, at dinner or whatever, and people who've had the exam will be like, oh my God, I know that scooch moment, or like, yes, that clicking is awful. And people just get it. But if you haven't been in that exam room before, none of this really makes sense. And so this was a way for people who have not had that exam to get a sense of how terrible it is in a way that's not just me telling you, because that's just not very impactful. And so radical empathy really formed this really great way to bridge this huge informational and emotional gap.
Absolutely.
Do you have any advice for designers who might want to also employ radical empathy in their own processes? Any pro tips?
You're on mute, Fran.
Yeah, I think more than just radical empathy, but just more in general with research is, I think when Rachel and I joined and when we were doing this first phase of research, we thought we had already expanded kind of our small group of understanding into a bigger understanding. I think the key piece of this is that there's always more to learn. And so, when we got called out by Autostraddle, which we really appreciated that honesty, we found that even though we thought we had made it so far, we really haven't made it far enough. And it's not to say that this is a moving target, you're never far enough, but there's always more to learn, and to being open to that. And having that radical empathy both ways, right? Like we did this with other people. So our stories were read back to us in the first person by people who hadn't had the exam. But then to have these other people, these LGBTQ plus patients, tell us their stories, and for us to even imagine being in their shoes, you know, having that duality of like, oh, we helped somebody else understand our part, but we also need help understanding their part. So just having that, keeping that in mind, that you don't know everything, even though you might know a lot, and there's more to be heard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think like building off of that. So these are experiences where Fran and I have our own experiences. And that's often the case in design, unless you like have a very specific client that might be for a unique product that you have no interest in or have never used. Like we have that sometimes as well. But in the case where you actually have very strong emotional attachment to something, which is like often the case with healthcare, especially with an exam that you have experience in, like Fran said, it's really important to not get blinded by your own experiences and just constantly be asking people like how their experience has gone. I think that's also been the blessing of like our Instagram and our inbox and just getting DMs from people, because people actually want to share these stories. And so even outside of like our official research and our official interviews that like, you know, we record and we synthesize those, we're constantly getting stories in our inbox that we're also reading and learning from as well.
Is there a particular interview moment or story moment that really stands out to either of you?
Yeah, for sure. I think Rachel and I might have the same one, but during one of our interviews, we were talking to a person who had, through secondhand stories from her family, had just heard of really, really awful, traumatic, like violent assault stories from this exam. Out of that, she developed a fear and had never had her exam. And during our interview, she mentioned that because she read about Yona, she decided to go in for her exam for the first time. And I think both Rachel and I cried without her knowing, but we both cried during that moment, because it really just gave us this window of like, oh, well, we're not just shouting our message into the void. It's actually making a change even in one person's life.
Yeah. That's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, and I think, and that particular participant or person was 34 as well and had just never had the exam, and we just were like super stoked that we inspired even one person to go in.
Definitely. Yeah, that's incredible. Anonymous asks, would you mind talking a little bit more about your decision to use pink as the coloring?
Yeah, I guess if that's for like the device itself or the branding itself, but let's see. So I think we were really inspired by this kind of spectrum of blues to reds. So, and kind of pink and purples falling in the middle of there. If you look at our website, you'll see kind of a use of these gradients in our, we had like disposable photography and like film camera style. So it's like a little bit grainy and we apply these filters to them. And really thinking that in terms of like the spectrum of gender. So thinking about blue to red and like landing in between. Personally, if I'm like critiquing my own work from 3+ years ago, I would push away from like the pink, because pink itself is very gendered, but we've tried to be like a little bit stronger in terms of like typography and use of blues and other colors. But yeah, that's just kind of where it landed, or like these deeper reds.
And adding on to that from the speculum side of things, we already had a pretty strong brand and brand language built up around what Yona is. And so we wanted the speculum to fit in with that family as well. And, you know, looking at existing clinical devices as there are a lot of these light baby blues and light greens. It's a very safe clinical color. And we wanted to differentiate away from that as well, but also not venture into being too femme or being too playful.
Yeah, I recalled in your presentation you were talking about how you didn't want it to look fleshy or like a toy. I definitely empathize with that. I see a lot of grays and off-white in medical design, which definitely isn't appealing. I don't want to be around it. So I do appreciate the intention behind the CMF quite a bit.
We did take, you know, a field trip to Good Vibrations, which is a sex positive store in San Francisco. That was not only just to get initial ideas around form, but also like color and what's more approachable to folks.
It was a really great inspiration trip because that's something that people seek out and desire to have in their lives, as opposed to a speculum, which is this source of horror. But they both go into the same space. So what makes one really appealing and what makes one really awful? So we really wanted to draw inspiration for that.
Awesome. That kind of bleeds into this next question. So Jacob asks, how are you approaching the conversation with the actual doctors? This is a big part of the pelvic exam experience. And then something that I want to add to that is, have you had the opportunity to speak to anybody who actually uses the speculum regularly in their day job, and gotten responses from them or reactions from them? And how has that gone if you have?
Yeah, we actually have several clinicians on our board of advisors. These are people we've reached out to when we have developments in the speculum or just developments in the Yona arc in general. And they've been so gracious to be able to help us out. And so one of our advisors, she's a clinician at Planned Parenthood. And so we've been able to go in and meet her and talk to her about what her workflow is. She's been a clinician for 30 years, I think. So to her, she does like 9-10 of these exams every day. So she's able to tell us about the details of like, here are some of the hacks I've used, or here are some of the things that I see new providers fresh out of med school doing. Here are some of the pain points in the clinic. Here are some of the things patients complain to me about. And all that has been really, really helpful in feeding into what our development is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's something that's been really crucial in our process. And luckily we were doing this with prototypes pre-COVID. So we were able, like Fran said, to go meet with them in person. Fran and Hailey would bring them prototypes, like foam models, as well as like actual 3D printed prototypes that they could handle. And we would document how they're handling it, how, like, what angles are they using? How are they like tilting their head and looking into it? So that in-person experience from our practice providers was crucial for us.
Yeah, and speaking of angles, that was one of those early anecdotes that really stuck out to us. Was we had gone in with these different angles of the handle as merely like an ergonomic study of like, because currently a lot of the metal speculums are at this 90-degree, it looks super harsh. It looks like a power tool rather than a medical device. And we went in with these ergonomic forms that were like 100, it was like 90 to 100 and something degrees. And it was interesting because one of our clinicians gave us the feedback. She was like, oh, this like tiny amount of angle gives me a little more space for my hand so that when I'm with a patient, I'm not running into their body. Like they don't have to scooch as far off the end of the table in order for me to conduct the exam. So just a small change like that can make a huge difference in not only their particular process, but the experience of the patient, right? Like not making that last scooch is such a huge deal.
Yeah, not having somebody bump into you too, feel like the entire process is startling already.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody actually asked a question that kind of branches off of that and is wondering if you could speak more to the designed features and how they were influenced from your diverse research group. So it sounds like you touched on this a little bit. I wonder if there's anything additional that you want to add to that?
Yeah, so that the angle was one of those things, one of these ergonomic things that came up. Something else that came up was the reason why we went with the handle and the 2 leaves is because of the anatomy of where your bladder sits. And so, being able to go to 2 leaves meant you might have the same field of view without pressing upwards into the bladder as much, which is what actually causes a lot of pain and discomfort. There were a few other, I guess I should clarify, is this a question more around the provider needs or the patient needs?
They didn't specify. I'd like to hear about patient needs though.
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing that we heard from the patient side of things is the metal is super cold. You'll have some providers who actually have a separate speculum warmer, but that's fairly high end. A lot of clinics don't have something like that. So you'll find providers who, they actually begin their exam just by, they'll sit there and hold the speculum and warm it up in their hands to make it a little bit less jarring. So that was a big driver of why we wanted silicone on the outside of the device.
Would you say that your experience designing a more medical facing device is significantly different from designing a non-medical device? And I imagine it is. If it is, could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think the biggest difference with a medical device is thinking ahead about all of the requirements and regulations that you're going to inevitably have to meet. That's a big driver of decisions, and it's a big driver of trying to simplify things as much as possible. I think if you're designing for consumer electronics, there's this benefit of being able to add additional bells and whistles, additional functionality and features that are great selling points. That's all great and fine, and you do want to make sure that you're hitting all those functions in a medical device, but every time you add something of complexity, it changes the type of regulations you then have to meet, which then extends timelines, makes budgets more complicated, and just makes it more risky.
Mm-hmm.
Lauren asks, was there any pushback from your employer when beginning this important project with the various staff members from different teams?
I would say no. So at Frog, we really encourage what we call bench projects.
Mm-hmm.
I think what's challenging is really finding the time to do them. So that's really kind of the issue, because of course, client work and billable work will come first in a workplace. But no, we were really supported by the studio and continue to be supported by Frog.
That's awesome.
But really,
we're really fortunate in that we.
Go ahead, Fran. I was just, I don't know. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I was just going to say, bench projects, the reason why we've been able to do this for so long, like I mentioned at the very top of the talk, is our personal dedication and passion. And Fran and I do this in the mornings, in our weekends, in our all around worked hours. And this is something that really we're motivated because we know that it's so needed. And yeah, so it's really our own dedication. But
yeah, I think what I wanted to add is that I think we're very fortunate in the type of workplace that we're in. I think we're surrounded by other people who are also driven just by personal passion and interest in whatever it might be. And for us, it happens to be Yona. And so we've been able to work with people who have also given us their time in order to help us in our process. And but besides that, it's kind of to Rachel's point. It's balancing, focusing on client work when we need to, and then etching out the time elsewhere when we need it for Yona.
Yeah, that sounds like quite the balancing act. And then do you have any tips for designers who'd like to employ their employers to be inclusive and approach design projects like this? And this is a continuation of Lauren's question.
Yeah, I think something that I've been thinking about a lot recently is this idea of power to be an advocate. I think that when we're in a workspace or, when we work for a client, we often feel like we're in the position where we can't necessarily say something. It's like, oh, that decision's already been made. They are employing me or they are paying me to do this work. But I think that as challenging as it is in that situation where it feels like there's no choice, there is still a right choice. And there is still a right course of action, which is to say something. And hopefully that this is a workplace that encourages people to object to something that's like, oh, this is actually not inclusive, or this practice feels wrong. And I think finding what that voice is for each individual person is different, and finding what that comfort level of how much you're willing to say and how much you're willing to push is an individual thing as well. But I do think that everybody can start to explore where that balance or where that boundary is for themselves as an individual.
Mm-hmm. And also, I mean, inclusive design is good. It's good business. It's where the world's going. And I really think that clients recognize that. And we have clients that are asking for that more and more. But it really is our job as designers, like Fran said, be advocates. We're the ones who are looking at the trends. We're looking at the culture, and we're supposed to bring that to our clients because that's what they pay us for. So I think you can totally bring that in as part of your pitch.
Totally. Do you feel
I want to add one more thing, which is that sometimes it's not even necessarily have to be obvious, right? Sometimes if it's a choice between two things and one is slightly more inclusive than the other, then it's does it cost that much more to do it? And can you sneak it in some ways?
Have you found that that since your journey with Yona, you've attempted to do that more with other projects, or paid more attention to it, or been more sensitive to it?
Definitely, for sure. I mean, I think even just the idea of not using femme or she, her pronouns, or using women's care, that idea of like, oh, what is the language around it? That's something that we started small. We started just by focusing on Yona and being like, okay, this isn't the women's exam anymore. This is vaginal care. But that idea kind of spans outwards when we're talking about other things like, oh, well, maybe we don't have to use a specific pronoun here. Maybe we can just use they.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think we kind of mentioned this in the talk too, but like it's a constant learning, and we've evolved, and we're continuing to evolve. And I think it's just important to keep kind of bringing that back to the workplace too.
Yeah, embracing that is really healthy. It's something that Rachel and I do. We keep each other in check when one of us gets a pronoun wrong or we use the wrong adjective. And I think by now, I mean, like we have figured out how to communicate that with each other, but it's very easy for us to be like, oh, actually that was wrong. We'll change that. Make sure we use the right one next time.
That's awesome to have a buddy to kind of call you out when you're slipping up a little bit.
Yep.
Going back to when you were speaking to people, doing your research, Genevieve asks, how have male doctors specifically received this product? What do they think of it?
We haven't actually spoken to male doctors, and that's actually something that we'd be really curious to hear about from a male doctor's perspective. I mean, I think they're using it the same way as a female doctor would. But we did hear from some patients that, you know, it's very polarizing, the people who are either really, really pro male doctor or really, really against male doctor. Some people believe that as a person who had never had this particular exam, they couldn't be empathetic to the pain. They might have even had a personal experience where a male doctor was fairly dismissive of a pain or a complaint. But we also heard on the other end, which is one of our interviewees was saying, well, it's hard to be a male gynecologist. So if they've been practicing for as long as they have, they must be really good at what they do. And that was actually something they sought out, which was super interesting.
That is interesting. That's an interesting viewpoint too. I would have never have thought of it that way.
Mm-hmm.
Right. We've got another question from Shelby. Says, hello, I'm a former nurse from Planned Parenthood, and I'm really interested in this product. I'm wondering if you have discussed with nurses or providers about using the speculum for procedures like IUD insertion or removal. Additionally, have you thought about making different sizes of the speculum?
Absolutely. For sure, this is something that we would want to be used in IUD insertion as well. Pelvic exam is just one application. We do think, though, that the speculum that we're currently developing is more geared towards clinical use rather than surgical use, but there are many clinical procedures that could be done with this. As to sizing, yes, we definitely want to come up with multiple sizes. With our statement about focus earlier, though, we're going to start with one and then branch out to multiple. But it was very interesting talking to some of the providers about the idea of sizing a speculum. We find that there are groups of people who perhaps they've had multiple children, or for whatever reason, they have just a lot of redundant tissue, and so they tend to need a larger size. But there are many people who don't really need much of the range of motion of speculum at all. And so we're definitely targeting making our speculum smaller than current speculums.
Awesome. Joyce says, one, thank you for your inclusive message and thoughtfulness, which is awesome. And then asks, how much personalization in the experience and industrial design was taken into account when it came to designing for a diverse group of people?
Personalization as in like for individual patients, or?
I wonder if Joyce means, and Joyce, sorry, if you want to clarify in the chat, I'll open that up too. I wonder if they mean, like, did you take any personal design approaches? any touches that you were inspired by with other products that you kind of infused into this one? Joyce, I hope I'm getting that right.
Yeah, I mean, I think we go back to something that Rachel brought up earlier, which is taking a field trip to good vibrations. That was a big part of our thinking that went into this, which is how can we make something that is invasive and is super, super personal and intimate? How can we make that feel both clinical but also approachable, but also something that you trust in? And so going to Good Vibrations and seeing some of the devices there and understanding, oh, these are materials that are in fact body safe. These are materials and forms that are familiar. People feel comfortable around them. People actually seek them out. And trying to tie that in, but also balancing it with making sure that this is a device that's going to perform equivalently or better than existing devices, making sure that we achieve that functionality. I hope I answered that, Joyce.
Yeah, and I think even just speaking about like the experience really quick. So as we kind of talked about our journey, like in the beginning, we were focused on like this entire kind of Yona ecosystem, and we put together some concepts, including like meditation experience, you know, a better way to get your results. And those are really just, you know, concept seeds, as well as like the moment where you put like where to put your butt. So those are like moments through the experience where we're thinking about, okay, how can you have, you know, a more human touch point in this experience? But since then, we've kind of paused on those concepts and have shifted to our sole focus of the speculum. So just want to clarify that if that wasn't clear.
Awesome. And I just got a chat message from Joyce who said, what I mean by personalization is how much did individual experiences by different people, how much did the individual experiences from different people weigh on the final design?
Yeah, it was interesting because when we talked to a lot of different patients, there were some big things that came up repeatedly. And some of those were those audible cues, so the metal jingling or the plastic ratchet sound, if you happen to have a plastic speculum. There was also just the pinching metal. There are these things that came up repeatedly, and those were kind of our number one targets for things we wanted to get rid of immediately.
Oh.
And then Anonymous asks, how did you conduct the usability test while you were designing Yona?
We are still getting to that point, but the requirements and regulations around testing are pretty strict. So not only do you have to get a prototype, but then you have to do a sufficient amount of bench testing in order to satisfy requirements before you even get to testing with patients. We've actually had a lot of inbound of people who are volunteering themselves to be testers, which is amazing to hear that. There are a lot of people out there who are, I can't remember the exact terminology, but in med school, there are people who are designated testers or designated practice, if you would, patients. These are people who have specialized training, and they work with medical students to allow medical students to practice a particular procedure on them. So those would be people that we would be working with at some point.
Awesome. Are there other medical devices that you think could benefit from the Yona touch?
Absolutely. I think yes. So yeah, I mean, for us, we're really trying to stay focused right now on the speculum, but you know, we've definitely received a lot of requests for, can you redesign the mammogram experience? Like Fran said earlier, the table and the stirrups. You know, with medical devices and innovation, there's not much. And it's really just been this history of a kind of a slow nod to innovation. So we're hopeful that just even us existing has made waves, and hopefully, you know, we can see some impact in the medical device space.
We have another question that says, I would love to know how you got the inspiration to develop this product. Was it a conversation you had at Frog? Was it after one of you had a bad experience? I'm curious to know what sparked the idea to move forward with this initiative, and especially considering it's become such a focus for the two of you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can take this one. So in the beginning, we kind of talked about how Hailey and Sahana, who are kind of original co-founders along with us, had their exams within the same week. And they just really took this lens that, you know, we learn as designers, which is, let me like analyze this experience. Why is it like this? And, you know, after just doing some really initial research, found the device, which is very interesting in the fact that it hasn't been redesigned in nearly 200 years. And it's a pretty horrible experience. It's something we don't talk about. There's a lot of stigma around it, or at least, you know, in 2017 when we started, there was a lot more. This was something that was really under the table. So it really just felt like a right space to kind of jump in and ideate and experiment and put our concepts out there. And I think to answer your second question of why do we, you know, still do this? Why do Fran and I put so much energy and time into this? Is because of the, you know, the feedback that we've got. People want this like yesterday.
Yeah.
So, you know, the fact that this is so wanted and so needed, it really keeps us going and motivates us to move forward, because this hasn't been redesigned in 200 years. That's absolutely unacceptable.
Yeah, I want to touch on something, Rachel, that you hinted on, which is this idea of taboo. I think when we were first starting out this work, we really just found that this is something that's like a complete floodgate, right? When you're in the clinical room, you're there by yourself, and then you leave and you never want to talk about it or think about it until you have to get your next exam. But, you know, if you're at dinner with a glass of wine and a bunch of other people, and somebody is like, oh, I went to the gyno, and everybody around the table is like, yes, it was awful, I get it. And just realizing that people needed that platform. And as soon as you remove that idea of taboo and you remove that idea of shame around it, it no longer has to be kind of like a secret conversation that you have to have only within your friend group anymore. It becomes something that's more public and something that people have the permission to talk about, which means they have permission to discuss the shortcomings and actually ideate on.
Mm-hmm. And I think to build on that, like, this is an experience that you're having with your doctor by yourself in a room where, you know, you're naked, you're in a gown, you already feel really exposed and vulnerable. And anything that that doctor says or does, you're going to feel like they're in the right and you're in the wrong. So if you have a terrible experience, you might think that it was maybe your fault. A lot of, you know, there's a lot of trauma survivors that just, you know, go into this experience and it's very traumatizing. We've heard of a lot of abuse that's happening actually inside of exam rooms. And this is something that you might leave and think that, oh, well, that was the doctor and they're always correct. But when we create this platform for people to have this conversation, you start to hear stories and say, oh no, I had that same experience and you're right, that wasn't okay. And then you can actually start to heal from that. So we feel like that's really important as well.
Definitely. A lot of people are asking, when is this going to be available?
We're working on it as soon as we can.
Right. I can't find it anymore, but I did see a question earlier. Do you think that this is going to be adopted pretty quickly by physicians, or do you think that there might be pushback? Because I know that some things kind of take a while to become adopted, especially in a sector like medical design, which tends to be like, this is how we do it, therefore we will continue to do it this way.
Yeah, adoption has definitely been one of our key tenets throughout the process of our design. I think in terms of the rate of adoption or the speed of adoption, we're getting a mix of feedback. There are some people who are already doing a lot of super holistic and inclusive care, and they're the ones reaching out to us who are like, we want this now, we would love to use it, send it, like, can we order 10 right now? And then there are people who are maybe more reserved and are waiting to see if it'll get adopted later on. In talking with one of our advisors, we learned that it's actually a really interesting thing. You know, you think that it's usually the older, more experienced providers who've already done something maybe a certain way for like 30 years, who might be resistant to change. But in fact, it might be kind of a mix. You know, some of the newer providers, newer doctors who have only trained on a specific speculum, and, you know, they're in the very, very beginning of their career and their practice. And to them, it might just be like, oh, well, now I have to learn yet one more tool, and it might complicate my process. I'm already nervous going into this exam. I know that I'm more likely to be able to even find the cervix if I use the speculum that I'm already familiar with. And that's going to minimize discomfort for the patient, and it's going to make this exam go faster. So they might not be as enthused to adopt it right away, but that's not saying that they wouldn't in the future.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think there's just another piece to that, which is, if we're looking at hospitals or health medical institutions, they already have these relationships with distributors. So that's really why our goal is to get in with an existing medical device company and partner with them to tap into those distribution channels. Because if the speculum is coming to a hospital, then a doctor is more likely to use it.
Yeah, and
Yeah, I think, oh,
touched
go
on
ahead.
this when we were talking about the research and the outcome of the LGBTQ plus interviews, but medical education plays a huge part in adoption, right? So if an educational institution is using a speculum, a particular speculum, the students leaving that will then be familiar with that and will advocate for that in their next workplace. And so we really believe that that plays a really big role into the rate of adoption going forward.
Yeah, because I noticed that the Yona concept it's familiar. Like it's definitely new, it's definitely different, it's been improved, but it is still familiar. So I feel like that'll definitely play into early adoption, hopefully.
Yeah, that was a choice that we had to make about halfway through our development. We had some concepts that were more out there that had different mechanisms or different modes of operation. And there was definitely appeal in that, right? It's like, oh wow, we're going to completely change this. It's going to be something totally new and totally interesting. But we really had to dial that back because it's like, okay, well, if people are so unfamiliar with it that they don't even know what to do with it or they don't know what the outcome is, then there's no chance that they would continue to use it.
Right.
Dial it back into a shape that's slightly more familiar, but a little bit challenging.
Yeah, and I think we also really see this as like, it's not the end all be all speculum, it's just the next speculum. So like, hopefully there'll be like an evolution even on top of this as we continue to just improve for both patient and provider comfort.
I kind of see, I mean, this is just maybe me being blue sky, but I kind of see the Yona concept as being like the tipping point where innovation is finally going to be more accepted in the medical space because the medical space could totally benefit from it.
Yeah.
Love for that to be the case.
I mean, and there are a lot of providers that do request and want this because, I mean, if you look at the metal speculum, it's again like made for right-handed people only. That's insane. What other profession like do they have their main device only made for right-handed people?
Yeah.
Like that's archaic. So I think there are a lot of people that, are looking and excited about something that does solve their pain points, like single-handed locking and, dual hand use. So.
Well, I would love to keep asking questions, but it is now 8:28. I want to be respectful of your time and give you a few minutes to say anything additional if you have any final remarks.
Get your exam.
I mean, we could like really talk about this all day, but yeah, I think what Fran said, thanks for listening. And yeah, you can follow our Instagram, read our article, talk to your doctors, talk to your friends, really just want to continue to start this conversation.
Spread the word. And if you feel so compelled to share your story with us, we're here, we're listening.
Yeah, and our email is also on our website, it's yonacare.com.
I think everyone here is going to email you. Everyone seems super excited. Everyone's saying thank you. This was great. This was really amazing. So I guess that concludes this first conversation series. I think this was a really excellent way to kick it off. Thank you for everyone who came out. Thank you, Fran. Thank you, Rachel. This was excellent. I know that there were some technical difficulties before this, but it all seemed to work out, which is awesome. So yeah, if everyone would like to learn more about Yona, I believe Michaela posted their website link in the chat. So definitely check them out, send them your stories, send them your support, follow them on Instagram. You can also follow Women in ID on Instagram if you'd like. We post a lot about upcoming events. And yeah, I think that's gonna call it.
I just posted the article as well if you're interested in checking that out.
Awesome. Well, have a good night, you two.
Thank you all for attending. And thank you for hosting, Miranda.
Of course. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.